I'd love to hear your thoughts on how masculinity weaves into some of the threads we've been pulling on. And I'll just leave that totally open because I feel like there's so many things to say about that.
I think it's huge. And it's one of the subjects that I'm very preoccupied with, especially as somebody who grew up in, you know, sort of a traditional American Midwest Rust Belt, small rural town kind of environment. It's a tragedy that I have had so many male friends in my life that not only do not seem to have the tools to enjoy the connections that come through vulnerability and the emotional work that sometimes it takes to build deeper relationships with others and ourselves. And it's not just that a lot of these folks were denied the tools through the cultural expectations, but the project of acquiring those tools was seen as somehow taboo or a way to become weak or less than or something other than masculine. And it's something that I've dealt with my entire life, the tension between those expectations and what I am. I remember I won a statewide poetry contest when I was in the 5th grade, and I had to miss a football practice to go to the banquet. And explaining why I had to miss to coaches, with teammates around. um it was like I was telling them that I had to miss because I was being abducted by aliens that day. I mean, there was just no cultural script to even navigate that, except that anything that is other and sort of traditional American masculinity is often sidelined or met with, at best, playful teasing and at worst, hate and derision and being ostracized. So I've always felt like I have operated in sort of a strange liminal space where I love weightlifting. I was a boxer, but I have written nature poetry for 30 years. And it's it's another one of these times when I feel like narrative becomes a trap if you don't constantly interrogate it, if you don't have a conversation with it. Because there will always be a ready-made, prepackaged, store-bought narrative for anything you want, identity or morality. You can always just grab the first one off the shelf. And people don't seem to understand what they give up by taking that convenience. I know that my life is richer for being able to speak openly about my mental health struggles, about my vulnerability and uncertainty, about my own sense of worth, about being vulnerable in love, in the human yearning for connection and self-expression and creation. Do I also like to talk about the bench press? Sure. And it's just it sometimes, always feels so tragic to see peers and friends and loved ones bullied by a cold, dead narrative into shrinking themselves into only certain little corners of human experience. And so I do all this writing in social media, and every once in a while, I like to post a picture of myself. Um, and partly I'm doing it to say, like, hey, here's a here's a man doing these things. And inevitably I always get comments, oh, I thought you were a woman. And it's like, oh yeah, that's because I'm being thoughtful and empathetic in a in a open public context. So it's a conversation that is important to me and that I want to have. And it's another one of those big sort of like the purity narrative thing conversations, that I feel like the only way we fix it is through intentionally rejecting it. And then in my case, I think the thing I can do is be a visible example of another way to interact with the world and myself. Yeah. And, and I just sincerely and earnestly hope it helps someone. Because, yeah, growing up, there were so many ways in which I kind of had a general sense that I didn't fit narratives. And I know this is true of so many folks, but I think it would have been helpful to me to have other examples of sort of whole and functional lives that had the same sorts of interests and loves and struggles that I had. So, I feel like at the least I have an obligation to try to, with the visibility that has come from my writing and social media following, I feel an obligation to at least be a visible example of somebody who rejects traditional narrative expectations of what masculinity is and how it should be performed.